We want to welcome you today to a Christian Higher Education Innovation Alliance, CHIA as we call it, webinar. And we were able to present this material to the 2018 CCCU International Forum, which took place in Dallas, Texas at the end of January, early February. And I'm very happy to introduce you to some of my colleagues within Christian higher education around the world. And without further ado, let me introduce our colleagues here to you, and we'll get started. First of all, we have Andrew Sears with City Vision University. He is currently serving as the president of City Vision, and you'll hear some great things from him as far as what he's doing and how he's looking at innovation in some space within Christian higher education. Of course, myself, I'm currently the Chief Information Officer at LaTourneau University here in Longview, Texas. And we have David Shynn from Biola, and David will speak to some amazing things that he's worked through in all the material and interactions he's had. Chancey Bosch from Oral Roberts wasn't able to join us today. He had a family emergency. We will have some of his information on our slides if you want to contact him regarding some of the material that he's done in Uganda within Africa. And then Mike from Azusa Pacific, he serves as the executive director there in what I refer to as the Innovation Center of Azusa, but he'll introduce himself and tell you more about that there in the Los Angeles area. So without further ado, let me look at, just give you a quick update on what the Christian Higher Education Alliance is. It was founded in 2016. Andrew, myself, Jay Gary, who serves at ORU, and Mike, we got together and said, is there a way that we can collaborate in a greater way among ourselves as to what we're doing, how we're furthering the cause of Christ within Christian higher education, specifically focused on spreading that diffusion across our organizations. And we have a website and a listserv at chia.org for more information. And of course, we'd be glad to have you join with us in that discussion, in that furthering of the spreading of diffusion of innovation. So now let me turn it over to Andrew Sears, who's the president of City Vision University. Andrew, go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Matthew. And so let's just go into the first slide, and I'll give you, I think that the real opportunity, a lot of times with all the changes happening in higher education, people are looking at the glass being half empty, and I really think that there's a huge opportunity right now. So in the first 900 years of higher education globally, we grew to have a market of 100 million students by the year 2000. And then in the next 25 years, it grew more than in the previous 900 years to 263 million students. And most of that growth is happening in the developing world. And you see 137 million new students in developing countries by 2025, and that's really being driven by what they're calling the emerging middle class, where there's 4.9 billion middle class globally by 2030. So if you advance to the next slide, this is really the map of Christianity that we need to be getting used to, where Africa's in the center. The Western part seems kind of small, and, other parts in the global South, China and Brazil and Latin America are also very large. So go to the next slide. And just to, another kind of major point to make is education getting more secular or Christian globally? And it depends really on how you ask the question, because if you put it in secular terms, then and you use the secular definition of higher education, then yes, it's a lot more secular. But if you look at who is in weekly education programs globally, then you have church attenders, almost 1.6 billion people compared to higher education. So that's an important point as we go into some of these next slides, because I think how we framed Christian education in many ways has been framed through a secular lens, and that's really hurting Christians. So Accredited education, through Bible colleges, Christian universities, seminaries, and Christian liberal arts colleges, primarily is happening through parachurch organizations. But there's this new category that's called non-traditional but accreditable education, and that's Bible institutes, missions trainings programs, correspondence and continuing ed, alternative education courses, and professional experience. And that's growing dramatically. And part of what's happening with the rise of the massive open online courses, or MOOCs, those are starting to become mainstream. And with new technologies, there's ways to measure these things so that you actually can get credit for them. And then there's the last category, which is non-traditional but non-accreditable education. And, I would like to be able to say I've listened to, 20,000 hours of sermons and read my Bible, many times through, and I should just get a degree because of that. But that's not going to happen. But there's things that where they are doing, what is pretty close to accredited education, that you can quantify the learning, and that can make a huge difference. So, one of the big challenges we've had is, as we're approaching the emerging world and the majority world, we're still expecting them to wear the suits of Western accreditation. And, you can't just throw away all the Western accreditation standards, but there still needs to be standards and signals. And a lot of that gets framed into this, different definition of higher education versus tertiary education versus vocational education. And, what missionaries have done in the past is they said, let's just get them to look like us and put them in, white suits, and all of a sudden we can say our job as missionaries is accomplished. But that's obviously not really the approach that we're trying to do in higher education. So just going to the next slide. Now, the big shift that's happening in higher education is moving from what's monolithic degrees. So my kids, they play with toys, and you can buy a big Tonka truck that doesn't come apart, but the best-selling toy company right now is Legos. And you have unbundled education, and that's the equivalent of Lego blocks. And individual Lego blocks aren't worth that much, but you combine them into a kit. And as I know, I've bought probably 30 or 40 kits for my kids. You spend a lot of money on those kids and on the kits, until all of a sudden you have a Lego city, and that's essentially like a modular university. And I think that this is the where we're moving, and what's needed really is to create interoperable standards. Legos are standard sized bricks, and what constitutes a kit, and how do you integrate a kit into the city, really is the key thing. And I've written some articles on that for the Christensen Institute. Clayton Christensen, the guy who coined the word disruptive innovation. So this is really what I think the huge opportunity is. I think that Christian higher education has an opportunity to grow by 400% by 2030 if we do it right. Ultimately, I think we're going to be shifting, and we're going to be moving. Jesus's model, he always had the crowds, the 5,000, the 120, the 12, and the 3, and I think it's kind of the same thing. So what that's going to be for us is you have this base of the Christian digital ecosystem. So that's all the Christian digital content, and also secular content. And the big one out there right now is the Bible app, with something like almost 200 million people using it. But you can start to build on this ecosystem. Going to the next. So you have courseware. So Third Millennium has put $34 million into building a world-class online seminary that they're giving away for free, and they're hoping to reach 100 million people with it. The people are Daily Bread. They have something called christianuniversity.org, where they're doing the same thing. There's all these MOOCs that are out there from MIT and Harvard that you can build on. And then in addition to just the Bible courses, you need Christian integration courses. And this layer is largely free, and you generally charge whenever you get to the next layer, which is alternative credit. And that really, I think, is going to become the dominant form for the first 3 years of college. So the average global cost might be as low as $100 a year. You're going to be building on Christian and secular courseware. And we've developed something called the Global Christian College Credit Consortium, kind of a counterpart to ACE credit for course level accreditation, to deal with that. And what we're really doing is we're trying to take this stuff that is non-traditional, and we're putting it into a standard formatting like the Legos so that it can, fit into the degree program. So that on the degree programs, the bachelor's, ultimately, I think the cost is going to go down a lot. The average global cost is probably going to go down to about $1,000 a year. A lot of those are going to be delivered online or through what I'm calling micro campuses. And the idea of a micro campus is just like in other industries where it used to be that, you had these giant breweries that would cost tens of millions of dollars, and then you have microbreweries. And, industry after industry, you kind of have that, whether it's on 3D printing or other things. It becomes fairly easy. For $50,000, you can set up a campus rather than several million. Or in some cases, it might even be less than 50,000. It could be 5,000. We launched this past year, we launched a $5,000 bachelor's degree program partnered with Sailor Academy. They're providing the first 3 years, and we provide the last year and try to really integrate their Legos into our system. And ultimately, as Christians, we believe that the biggest transformation happens, life on life, face to face. And there's ways that you can do that through these micro campuses and by having transformational campus community. So just going to the next slide. So this is just a slide that shows the $5,000 bachelor's degree that we offered with Sailor Academy. And ultimately, the way that works is students can take their first courses through Sailor, and then they get accreditation through Qualify and Global Christian College Credit Consortium, and they can transfer that to City Vision and get an accredited degree. So you can go to the next slide. So the Global Christian College Credit Consortium, what it's trying to do is it's an alternative path to accreditation for ministries, churches, and Bible institutes, where most accreditation will only accredit entire programs or entire institutions, but will accredit courses, so that, essentially saying these are all the same size Lego and they should fit into the Lego kits, is what that's doing. And you can look for that online and just go to the next slide. As Matthew mentioned, there's a Christian Higher Education Innovation Alliance. There's several different parts to the website. A lot of it consists of an email list where we have almost 100 people that are very active in discussions. And then there's webinars, like this will be put on our webinars section. I've pulled together a lot of this into kind of a synthesized course, and I'll be adding to that. So we'd love to have some of you join in the conversation just by joining this list. And I think there might be one more slide. Let's see.
That's all. Now we're on.
Okay, that's it.
David.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
All right. David, Senior Director of New Business Ventures and University Planning at Biola. David, share with us what God's laid on your heart in this space of Christian higher ed innovation.
Well, hello, everyone. Like Matthew said, I'm at Biola University, and just want to take a few moments to share some stuff we've been working on the last few years as it relates to global Christian higher ed. Back in 2015, our president, Dr. Barry Corey, he really felt the need to gather a group of representatives from really all over the world, in and out of higher education, to just have a few solid days to think about the challenges that face global Christian higher education and how we should be thinking about mitigating or addressing some of those challenges. The interesting thing about this group was that it really consisted of a lot of folks who are not necessarily traditional academics, but really innovators across various spaces such as business, real estate, even finance, technology, etc. And so these are folks that are just bringing in really more of an innovative mindset with a strong heart for Christian higher education, trying to think out of the box per se on how to approach the unique challenges that we have. So on the next slide, you'll see a picture of the group that assembled. Real interesting composition of folks, again, across different industries, all sharing a common heart for Christian higher ed. On the next slide, we'll see two of the major outcomes from this meeting. Essentially, as this group processed these challenges for about 2.5 days, what emerged was really two big priority areas. One was that when it comes to the future of Christian higher education, one thing that's always going to be a bit of a challenge is the dependence on government funding. And as we were talking about government funding, the interesting thing there was as many of the Americans were processing this, we felt, okay, that's definitely a real problem in the United States, but also how can we be thinking more globally? And the international leaders who were there said, thank you so much for thinking of the international space. We want to continue moving forward in that way. But frankly, even still, the U.S. Base of Christian higher education is considered the gold standard, and you guys really set the high bar for us. So in many ways, the health and future sustainability and success of the global market for Christian higher education depends on the U.S. market's health. So they were really encouraging us to really make sure that we take care of ourselves as well on this area of government funding. When it came to the second huge area of priority was the barriers that are just real when it comes to accessing global Christian higher education. I'll go over that a bit more later on in the presentation, but when it comes to global Christian higher ed, the barriers are many, and they range from big to small and financial to political and so forth. So a lot of challenges to overcome there. To really begin to work on these priorities, we actually assigned a working group to each of those priorities, and what I'll be focusing on today is what we were just simply calling Working Group B, which was the group assigned to thinking about the barriers to Christian higher education globally. This is the team that assembled a few months later, actually, in Indonesia. Again, an international group, and as you can see on this slide, quite a few represented organizations. A combination of universities as well as other types of educational organizations, as well as organizations that just simply care about education internationally. We look on the next slide, we'll actually see some of the data points that we were talking about as the group met. As Andrew mentioned earlier with that slide of the global map flipped upside down, the reality is that when we think about the population distribution of Christians across the world, if not already, in the coming years, really the global south, the majority world is where the majority population of Christians are going to be residing. That's where the growth is happening most rapidly. So as those really interested in Christian higher ed and the impact that it can have for the kingdom and the world, one of the convicting elements of this is that we can't simply stand back and abdicate the education in the global south or the majority world as that population is growing in their Christian populations. If we look on the next slide here, we'll see that this is actually a map where it's far from comprehensive, but it's an initial survey of Christian higher education institutions distributed across the world per capita. And as you can see clearly, when it comes to the United States and some parts of Europe and so forth, that's where we see higher concentrations. But where we actually see the growth in the Christian population, that's where there is the least amount of Christian higher ed available. And when we do find that it's available, it tends to be really focused on training pastors and missionaries. Unlike what many of us think of in the United States here, of Christian higher ed being focused on broad-ranging topics, so really being able to train you to be equally as much a pastor as a teacher or filmmaker or biologist, or whatever the case might be. So as the Christian populations are growing in these areas, there's often a duality in terms of thinking about how they think about the world as a Christian versus as a professional, and versus what we might think of as integrated perspective on vocation and faith. So if we go back to the next slide, or go on to the next slide, let's keep going to, let's go 2 slides over. We'll see that there's actually 4 main categories of universities that we're looking at here. So broadly speaking, the 2 buckets of those categories really include the traditional as well as the alternative types of universities. Within the traditional bucket, we have US-based or Western universities, as well as majority world universities. As many of you already know, US-based universities are seen in many ways as the gold standard for quality, credibility, and resources, and really have been designed with pathways to vocations, a lot of rich infrastructure, and we have the wealth and the resources to be quite holistic in how we approach it. The challenge, though, as U.S.-based universities think about global education, is that we really are often limited to our understand U.S.-based paradigms and not really having a comprehensive, robust understanding of how higher ed works in different international contexts. And frankly, the cost structures of how we do higher education in the U.S. make things quite cost prohibitive. As we look at these majority world universities that are doing great things, they're really trying to build out the higher education models in these various international contexts. The advantages they bring really are that they have quite a few established networks and relationships that can help them expedite what they're trying to do missionally. Often as younger universities, they tend to be more nimble. But when it comes to biblically integrated education, Christian higher education, they often have limited paradigms and limited views for how faith intersects with various disciplines. And unfortunately, still, these majority world universities still often suffer from limited international reputation for quality or credentialing. So those degrees sometimes face challenges in getting full recognition outside of their base country. When we look on the alternative side, two broad categories within that bucket. We have disruptive universities as well as what I'm simply calling non-university education providers. A disruptive university might be one like City Vision, Andrew Sears' university here, where these universities are coming into this free of many historic paradigms, coming in really thinking about how to design a modern university from the ground up. And often that means that these are designed with lower price points, lower cost structures, and a lot more agility. They tend to be younger and smaller and free of many of the traditions and historic constraints. Of course, the flip side of that is being younger and smaller, and startups really, they tend to be limited in resources and frankly prone to misunderstanding and skepticism from the potential student base, donor base, and even government organizations and so forth. They're just easy for folks to really question what's new and sometimes not quite fully understood. But the nice thing is, as they're growing and developing partnerships and so forth, and as the reputation builds, it'll be interesting to see what these disruptive universities do in this space. On the non-university side of things, we have quite a few organizations that are actually interested in dramatically changing higher education, but without necessarily the degrees that we're accustomed to in the university model. These organizations maybe are focused more on helping folks get jobs or learning the specific skills, and maybe in a form of credentialing, they're looking at badges or certificates or just some other form of assessment that vouches for the skills acquired. And they tend to be very flexible, very market savvy, tech savvy as well, and low cost. You see these organizations in South Africa, Latin America, and so forth, and really being experimental. One to look out for is Trinity Education. They're offering coding boot camps right now down in South Africa. They've also done similar boot camps in parts of Southeast Asia and South America. These organizations, though, tend to be most vulnerable because most of the time they're not getting any sort of aid support, and because their model is even more different than perhaps even what City Vision is bringing to the table, because they're not following the traditional degree model. They're the most vulnerable to misunderstanding and lack of funding at times. So with these four main categories, how do we think about the barriers to Christian higher education? Essentially, it comes down to 7 or 8 main points. The biggest probably is the price point. Traditional US-based cost structures really don't scale down easily. We have faculty compensation at a certain rate, the need to uphold these buildings and maintain them at a certain level, the different amenities really make it hard to scale things down. But I think there are quite a few of us who are actively trying to be creative and innovative in bringing down the price point. Most countries are unfamiliar with the model of integrated education. I mentioned that a few times here. And there really is a need for a custom strategy for nearly every country or region. mainly because of the differing views that the various ministries of education have and requirements. And several countries also are trying to handle higher education themselves. So for Christian universities, I think a key element here is to consider partnership more than anything else. Also to really, that partnership model respects what's going on in those countries. As I mentioned, the differing government policies and processes make it really challenging for US-based universities to navigate different contexts sometimes, but something to be aware of. And frankly, back home in the US, enrollment challenges and new domestic strategies are spreading institutional resources thin. I think all of us recognize the need to expand into new markets and offer what we have in contextually sensitive, relevant ways across different countries. And frankly, for most of us, I think there's a missional catalyst there as well. But the challenges that we face stateside in terms of enrollment often mean that we have fewer resources to experiment with and play with as we try to serve those out of our main markets. What does it look like actually to move forward here, though? Opportunities for collaboration are key. I think it really is best to address these challenges of global Christian higher education in partnership. The reality is that most to all of these challenges are bigger than what maybe one organization can handle all on its own. So that means that what we probably ought to do is lean into organizations like CHIA and others to really see how we can band together and share resources, share ideas, share networks and connections to tackle this problem together. Frankly, at this point, what we would say is we don't have the perfect solution, and what I would encourage you to do is reach out to those of us on this webinar, reach out to the CHIA group if you'd like to have exploratory conversations. I think developing these relationships and partnerships so we can figure out what strengths and assets we each bring to the table and how we can form a more comprehensive strategy as a Christian higher education movement more than as individual organizations is going to be the key to moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Very insightful information. Next, we have Mike from Azusa Pacific. He is the digital learning architect there, and actually I think your title has executive director on top of that as well.
Yeah.
So Mike, go ahead and take it over.
Well, thank you, Matthew and Andrew and David. So what I will be sharing, I want to first make a disclaimer that the views and opinions expressed in my part of the presentation are fully mine and do not necessarily reflect what my institution, Azusa Pacific University, in terms of what they're thinking or what they're doing, because I want to be sensitive to not project what I'm going to be sharing with what my university is doing. So with that aside, my particular presentation is going to be focused on the microcampus, and it really, I think, draws from what David and Andrew have shared up to this point. You know, in terms of what Andrew has shared, you know, he had that diagram of the pyramid where, you know, at the very top, you know, you have sort of these models of the few, or how do you have these transformational in-person campus experience, and then also drawing from David in terms of sort of the idea of the unique strategy for each country and how we think through how the gospel move in individual countries and how you become sort of contextualized. So that's sort of the framing for what I'm going to be sharing. But first, I want to kind of give you an overview of how we currently serve majority world students from the U.S. perspective as U.S. school. So if you, Matthew, if you can kind of just go through and, yeah, so thank you. So the first part, I think the first strategy that is commonly used among U.S. schools is this idea of recruiting international students from outside U.S., bring them to U.S. schools. As we know, this model is limited and it's also very costly, and it's the students who do come to U.S. are primarily coming from the elites, the very well-to-do from other countries. And in 2017, we had over 1 million international students come to the U.S. to study. But that's really just a drop in the bucket compared to the total number of students who would be qualified to sort of get higher education, as what Andrew was sharing. A second model, I think, is about how do we take US-based educational resources and content and services and distribute that beyond its border. And we've talked about up to this point, the different ways to doing online degrees and different ways of partnering with other universities. And I think that's been a model that's been used quite effectively in many places. And it is less costly than recruiting and bringing students to the U.S., but I think the impact is limited because it does not often have that comprehensive transformational experience that you would see on a campus experience for students. And then a third model is this idea of planting international branch campuses in majority world. This is where you have schools actually saying, no, we're going to actually start a branch campus in a particular country. We're going to sort of in some ways rebuild ourselves in another place. However, this is one of probably the most expensive way to do international education because just the cost is really high because of starting to either build the actual physical campus or the cost of employing the personnel to run it and so on and so forth. So what I'm hoping in the next remaining slides I'm going to do is talk about this idea of a micro campus where U.S. schools can partner with global foreign universities to establish these micro campuses, really requiring very little startup capital, and I would say very minimal risk involved because at the end of the day, because schools, the U.S. schools are not building physical campuses and employing large numbers of people, but rather there's this kind of close partnership with the local university. There will be very low risk, and yet that impact could be very high. And so this is sort of the vision of what I want to talk about is this idea of how do you use microcampus as a global strategy. So for me, I was born in Vietnam. I was there till about 5 or 6, and I've been in the U.S. since. But in recent years, God has put in my heart to really look at what can I do to advance Christian higher education beyond the U.S. and in particular in Vietnam. And so one of the things I've started to learn and read more about is these possibilities of having U.S.-based Christian schools partnering with local universities to offer joint programs or things that would be desirable from the Vietnamese learner and student perspective. And part of this strategy of low cost is this idea of using the flipped classroom model where the US-based professors would be recording their lectures and then putting that online. And then at the local campus is where you would have the in-person discussion and practice. And typically in a microcampus location, you would have a local faculty as well as an employee that's employed by the U.S. school, but it's a expat. It's a U.S. person who just simply lives in the country, and they sort of are qualified to serve to represent sort of the U.S. side of the university, but they co-teach the course with the local faculty. And so you have sort of this dual faculty role, the two faculty in the course, and they are kind of sharing and facilitating the learning in the class. The idea of $30 per unit cost is something that I recently was just thinking about how, for the most part, that's about $1 a day. The average, majority world, most people live around, a little bit over $1 a day. Maybe it's closer to $2 a day nowadays. And I was just thinking about how is it that we can deal with costs in a way that's going to allow access, to increase access. And as the previous two presenters have alluded to, cost is one of the biggest challenges that we face from the U.S. side in terms of taking what we currently have as a model for Christian education and trying to make that affordable to the majority world. Right now, it's just not a realistic way because we cannot scale down our costs anywhere close to affordability for the majority of the world. The idea of tuition revenue sharing with the local university is one way that allows for this microcampus strategy to work without a lot of upfront costs. So oftentimes how it would work is a US school would partner with a local university, and the negotiation goes somewhat like this. They would say to the local university, can you give us 2 classrooms and 2 offices? And in exchange for that, they would then share sort of the curriculum and also the personnel, the teaching load, and then whatever revenue that comes from the enrollment in the joint programs or the joint degrees or the joint certificates that's being offered will then be shared between the local university and the US-based university. And so the idea is that there is really no exchange of money, funds between universities. It's really about using local universities' facilities and the personnel, and then the US-based school being able to offer the curriculum and also to employ the local faculty in country to co-teach. And so I think this is one of those models where it could scale quite easily because it doesn't require that much overhead upfront. And I can point to the University of Arizona as one example. They have, I would say, close to 24 of these micro campuses across the world, and they've been very, very successful in terms of being able to start and launch programs. And more than that, what has started as an opportunity for the local students to get a U.S.-based education without leaving their country. For University of Arizona, they've also been now able to leverage these micro campuses for University of Arizona students, for them to do a semester abroad in these micro campuses, as well as for faculty to share their expertise and sort of maybe even do joint research projects. So there's been a lot of fruit that has come out of this micro campus idea for UA. If you can advance to the next slide, Matthew. So obviously there will be challenges to this model. The biggest one I see is U.S. institutions really continuing to focus its attention on the domestic market, even though the slide that Andrew shared earlier, how the greatest growth for Christian higher education demand is outside U.S. For various reasons, U.S. Christian higher education continues to focus on the domestic market as opposed to looking out. And I think that's going to remain the main narrative that we have to challenge. The second is, I believe that not faculty, but the administrators in particular are very cautious in terms of expanding globally. And oftentimes it's, given today's, political environment and the nationalistic focus, it's understandable. But I think oftentimes university leaders are not looking further down the line or looking more missionally at how we can expand Christian higher education in a way that could make a greater impact in the world. The lower per credit tuition obviously is going to be a very, very difficult model because, in terms of hiring faculty, in terms of just the overall revenue, making it profitable, as David has mentioned earlier, that how do you run something that is at such a lower cost structure than what we currently do in the US and make it sustainable, because oftentimes these programs are not sustainable because they just cannot cover the basic costs involved. And then the uncertainty in terms of the accreditation or other regulatory policies that oftentimes are just so unique to each country, and it can change literally overnight. And when you have a partnership with a local university and the country's policy changes, what happens then? How do you adapt and quickly adjust to those kinds of challenges? I think that's definitely going to be a barrier. And then my last slide here is a call to collaboration, like David and like Andrew. I mean, we really need to look to each other to move forward as opposed to trying to do this on our own. I want to sort of applaud Biola and its efforts in taking these steps in the last couple of years in their efforts, and I encourage more schools to join them and be able to contribute what they can to this movement, because I think that is a important way forward. And more than that, I think we can mobilize our resources. Each of our campus has so much resource that we can contribute to this project, whether it's personnel or computing resources or whatever. But oftentimes, we're pretty much siloed, and we get insular, and we don't want to contribute because we don't know what to expect. And so, but I think together, collectively, we can mitigate any kind of risks that are involved, and oftentimes we can maybe even have greater impact and accelerate the progress. Just one mention here of Union University International. This is a very tiny, small online seminary that's based in Orange County, and they are essentially training the majority of the pastors in Vietnam, and they've been doing this for the last 30 years. And I recently got to know them, and now I serve on their board, and I get to really see how they're doing this. And I think they're not so much a micro campus yet, but they do have sort of physical locations that they do off these. I mean, a lot of times it's at these churches, and so it's a very unique way of how they are doing these micro campuses. And I'm looking forward to sort of exploring maybe a way for UUI to even grow their physical presence in Vietnam, given their sort of history of having the trust, some of the challenges that David mentioned about the reputation and the credentialing and the trust. You just sometimes don't know, but the fact that they've been around for 3 decades, and most people in Vietnam recognize them as a legitimate institution of higher learning, I think that goes a long way. So if you go to the final slide, which is my references, I just want to just point you to the article that kind of talks about this idea of the microcampus. It was Brent White from University of Arizona, and that's the article that really inspired me to think about this model. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mike. Again, very good information, and thank all 3 of you for the time putting this together and sharing this with us. Again, if you have any questions on any of this, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. Our email addresses and so forth are on the presentation, as well as accessing us through the actual chia.org website. And of course, one of the folks who joined us at the CCCU, Chancey Boss with ORU, he's the assistant professor for the College of Education at Oral Roberts. He wasn't able to make it with here today with us, but there's his email address and his contact information, so be sure and contact him. He detailed some work he had with faith learning integration in Uganda, and some of the pictures of his work. So I think without further ado, we will end this session for today. And again, thank you for making your day time to listen and learn. And we hope, I think all 3 of us, or all 3 of the presentations, and myself included, our deep desire is to collaborate and working together for God's kingdom space here in Christian higher education. So thank you again, and we look forward to collaborating with you in the future. Thanks again.